On the map, Bhutan looks like a small fold of land tucked between giants. But the ground here rises so fast, it feels like the earth is trying to stand up. In these mountains, one peak, Gangkhar Puensum, about 7,570 meters high, still remains unclimbed, not because it is forgotten, but because it is treated like a living boundary between humans and the sacred. And below that vertical world, a modern country wrote an ancient promise into law. At least 60% of the land must stay under forest cover forever. So what happens when a nation protects its mountains and trees as if they can hear? Who gets to belong in a place built on height, silence, and belief? Bhutan is not a country that spreads outward. It climbs. From the humid lowlands near the southern border, the land begins a steep, relentless ascent, folding into ridgelines, tightening into valleys, and then lifting into the high Himalaya, like a stone staircase aimed at the sky. The sensation is immediate roads curl along cliffs, rivers cut deep grooves, and villages perch, where the slope finally allows a breath of flat ground. This vertical world exists because the earth here is not still. The Himalaya were born from a collision, an ancient ongoing push, where tectonic forces crumple and stack the crust into rising ranges. Over vast stretches of time, pressure and heat transform rock into harder, denser forms. Layers that once lay quietly under ancient seas are lifted, twisted, and exposed. In Bhutan, that story shows up everywhere in bands of rock that look like they've been folded by a giant hand in cliffs that reveal a layered past, and in valleys that feel too perfectly carved to be accidental. And then come the rivers, Bhutan's living geometry. Water here does not wander, it drops. From snowfields and high rainfall zones, streams gather and accelerate, slicing through ridges and pulling sediment downhill. Each river becomes a moving archive carrying grains of broken mountain-turning boulders into rounded stones and widening channels over centuries. In places where valleys open the landscape, briefly relaxes, forming pockets where towns can exist, where fields can be terraced, where life can settle without constantly bracing against gravity. But Bhutan's shape is not made by stone and water alone. The sky participates. The monsoon arrives like a seasonal engine, pushing moist air up the slopes until it cools and releases heavy rain. That rainfall feeds forests and farms, but it also tests the land's stability. When water saturates steep ground, slopes can fail. Ridges can shed rock. Roads can vanish under slides. In a country built on mountains, weather is not just atmosphere, it is force. This is why Bhutan's climate feels like many climates stacked on top of each other. Down low air can feel warm and dense. Higher up, it sharpens. Higher still, it thins into a cold that seems to erase sound. Temperature, vegetation, and even the rhythm of daily life change with altitude. A few hours of travel can feel like crossing continents, subtropical greens, giving way to temperate forests, then to high meadows, and finally to bare rock and snow. And in the highest reaches, the pass leaves a signature that can't be missed, the language of ice. During colder periods in Earth's history, glaciers expanded, grinding mountain faces and reshaping valleys. They worked slowly, but with patience that outlasts empires, polishing rock, dragging debris, and carving hollows that later fill with water. Even where glaciers have retreated, their imprint remains in the shape of the land valleys that feel broad and sculpted slopes that look planed smooth, and ridge lines that appear sharpened like the edges of a blade. Yet Bhutan's most dramatic geology isn't only in what has been built, it's in what is still being built. Mountains here are not a completed monument. They are a living process. Earthquakes are reminders that the crust is still adjusting, still stacking, still trying to find balance in a place where balance is never permanent. The question is not whether the landscape will change, but how fast and who will be caught in the change. This constant motion creates a strange kind of beauty, a country where serenity is framed by tension. A quiet monastery can sit above a river that never stops cutting deeper. A peaceful valley can be bordered by slopes that under the wrong rain might break. Bhutan's calm is not the calm of stillness. It is the calm of adaptation, of learning how to live with forces that do not negotiate. Look closely, and the landscape starts to feel like a set of thresholds, passes that open into new worlds, ridge after ridge that hides what comes next, clouds that move fast as if pushed by invisible hands. There are places where wind feels like it has traveled a long way to arrive here, dry, sharp, and purposeful. And there are moments when fog wraps a valley so completely that the mountains appear to vanish, turning the world into a blank page. In that blankness, it becomes easier to understand why Bhutan is often described with words like hidden or sealed. Not because it is unreachable, but because the geography itself filters experience. The mountains control movement. The weather controls timing. Distance is measured less by kilometers and more by elevation, by curves, by the mood of the sky. And if this is what the land does to the body, slowing it, lifting it, forcing it to notice, what does it do to a culture over centuries? When a nation grows inside steep valleys and high passes, does it learn patience differently? Does it learn restraint? Does it learn to treat the natural world not as scenery, but as an authority? Because here, nature is not a backdrop. It is the main character ancient, powerful, and still writing the next line. If the ground beneath Bhutan is still rising, still shifting, still being carved, then what exactly can be called permanent in a place like this? In Bhutan, wilderness isn't something that survives in the corners. It's the fabric that holds the whole country together. Forests press right up against villages. Rivers cut clean lines through intact hillsides. And if you climb high enough, the trees thin out into alpine ridges where the air feels so sharp it's almost metallic. One reason this feels possible is that Bhutan protects nature not as a slogan, but as a structure. Its constitution requires that a minimum of 60% of the country remains under forest cover, for all time a line drawn in law, not just policy. In practice, many reports place Bhutan's forest cover well above that threshold, often cited around the 70% range, which means the green on the map isn't decorative, it's dominant. And then there is the way Bhutan protects space not as isolated islands, but as a connected system. More than 51% of the country is described as protected areas, and biological corridors in unusually high proportion designed so wildlife can move, breed, and adapt without being boxed in by roads and settlements. 8 biological corridors established to maintain connectivity turn the country into something rare in the modern world, a landscape that still behaves like a landscape. So what lives inside that connected green? Start low in the warmer southern belt, where broadleaf forests feel humid and alive with unseen movement. The soundscape changes first. Insects, birds, water, everything layered. As you climb into temperate forests, you meet a different texture moss on stone pines that smell like cold resin rhododendron forests that can flare into color like a sudden fire when they bloom. Step higher still, and the world becomes quieter, stripped down to windrock and distance. Bhutan's biodiversity comes from this vertical stacking of habitats. Altitude creates new climates the way latitude does. And because those habitats are connected, many species don't just exist here, they travel through it. Some follow food, some follow seasons, some follow ancient roots written into instinct. Then one winter morning in central Bhutan, you understand that migration can feel like ritual. In the Phobjika Valley, black-necked cranes arrive as seasonal guests, large, elegant birds that seem to carry the cold air with them. This valley is widely known as one of their important wintering grounds, and Bhutan has built conservation and education efforts around their presence. When they appear over the open wetlands and grasslands, the scene doesn't feel like wildlife viewing. It feels like a return. The valley is pale with winter light. The ground is stiff with frost, and the cranes' black heads, white bodies, slow wing beats, move as if they've always owned the sky above this bowl of land. There's a reason this moment matters. Black-necked cranes are not abundant everywhere, and their habitats are fragile. In Bhutan, the crane's winter presence becomes a kind of annual agreement. People protect the valley. The cranes come back. The relationship continues. But Bhutan's most dramatic wildlife stories often live higher, where the mountains stop being scenic and start being severe. In northern Bhutan's alpine zones, cold, steep, and difficult to reach, snow leopards are described as confined to these high mountain habitats. Bhutan has carried out national survey work focusing on potential snow leopard areas within protected regions like Jigme Dorji National Park and other northern reserves. The snow leopard is rarely seen, which is part of its mythology. You don't spot it like a tourist trophy. You learn to read the land instead, the ridgelines, where prey might move the shadowed gullies, the silence that feels too complete. And somewhere below those ridges, in forests that sit between cloud and cliff, another symbol appears, the red panda, small, elusive, and dependent on healthy mountain forests. Conservation, reporting from WWF and others, describes Bhutan as a haven for globally threatened species, including red panda and snow leopard, and emphasizes how Bhutan's strong protection model supports intact habitats. What's important here is not just the species list. It's the idea that Bhutan's wildlife exists inside a living web, one that depends on space connectivity and restraint. Restraint is not an easy word in the modern world. Most countries run out of it long before they run out of land. But Bhutan has tried to build restraint into the system itself. When protected areas are connected by corridors, animals can shift their ranges as conditions change. When forests remain continuous, rivers run clearer slopes, hold better, and ecosystems keep their internal logic. WWF notes, Bhutan's unusually high level of protection and the constitutional commitment to forest cover as core reasons the country has maintained extensive intact forests and free-flowing rivers. Still, nature here isn't frozen in perfection. Mountain ecosystems are sensitive, and the Himalaya are warming fast in many regions. Even when a country protects its forests, it cannot fully protect itself from global climate forces. Recent reporting on Bhutan highlights increasing climate risks to mountain ecosystems, glacier melt flood threats, and infrastructure strain pressures that don't stop at national borders. And that is where Bhutan's biodiversity story becomes more than beautiful. It becomes urgent. Because if the cranes depend on a valley staying wet and open, what happens when rainfall patterns shift? If snow leopards depend on stable alpine ecosystems, what happens when temperatures rise and prey routes change? If forests hold the hillsides together, what happens when extreme rain arrives more violently than the roots can handle. Bhutan's wildlife is not separate from human life, it's braided into it. The same corridors that let animals move also protect watersheds that communities depend on. The same protected valleys that shelter wintering cranes are landscapes where people farm, walk, worship, and raise families. And in a country where environmental protection is written into the nation's identity, every ecological shift feels personal, like the land is speaking back. So, here is the question. Bhutan quietly asks the rest of the world, if a small mountain kingdom can protect more than half its territory through parks and corridors and legally promise to keep its forests standing, what excuse do the larger, richer, louder countries have? Before Bhutan became a kingdom with borders, it was something harder to define, a chain of valleys separated by ridges, each valley its own small universe. In places like this, history does not begin with a flag. It begins with a footprint, faint disputed and half buried. Some archaeological discussions suggest human presence in the region could reach back thousands of years, possibly as early as around 2000 BCE. But Bhutan's earliest timeline remains fragmentary, stitched together from limited finds, oral memory, and later chronicles. In other words, the land remembers more than the archives do. And in a mountain world, memory often lives in the practical details, where people could plant, where they could graze, where they could cross, where they could survive. Down in the warmer southern foothills, life would have been shaped by forests and rivers, dense vegetation, seasonal rain, and paths that appeared and disappeared with the weather. Higher up, where slopes narrowed and winters tightened their grip, the rules changed. The basic question was never romantic. It was simple. How does a human body remain fed and warm when the ground refuses to be flat? The answer for centuries looked like adaptation layered on adaptation. Terraces cut into hillsides so crops could grow without sliding away. Houses designed for insulation storage and smoke. Trade carried not just goods, but survival salt grain textiles, metalwork, moving along routes that were less roads than agreements with altitude. And slowly, a cultural pattern emerged Bhutan as a place where communities did not conquer the mountain. They negotiated with it. Over time, waves of migration and cultural influence shaped what Bhutan would become. Broadly, many accounts describe Western and Northern Bhutan as heavily influenced by Tibetan cultural and religious traditions, while Eastern Bhutan developed its own strong identity with language and customs that hint at older layers of settlement and mixing. Even today, Bhutan is often described through a few major cultural groupings, names that are not neat categories, but useful windows. Communities in the west and north, linked historically to Tibetan-derived culture and the development of Dzongkha as a national language base. Communities in the east, often associated with Changla-speaking groups, whose roots reflect deep regional continuity and blending. Communities in the south that share strong ties with the Himalayan foothills and the cultural worlds of the plains. But in early Bhutan, these weren't demographics. They were ways of living shaped by terrain. In one valley, people might farm and trade. In another, they might herd. Higher up still, the relationship with animals became a relationship with altitude itself. Yak herding and seasonal movement, where families learned the rhythm of shifting pastures, storms, and thin air. This is where Bhutan begins to feel like an anthropology of elevation. The higher the landscape climbs, the more life becomes seasonal, mobile, and tuned to small environmental signals. Cloud behavior, wind direction, snowpack, the smell of rain before it arrives. And then, into this already complex human geography came something that would bind Bhutan's scattered valleys into a shared spiritual language. Bhutan's cultural imagination is inseparable from Himalayan Buddhism, especially Vajrayana traditions that carry the feeling of hiddenness, sacred landscapes, and places where the physical world is never just physical. Many traditions place a turning point around the arrival of Buddhist teachings and masters who moved through the Himalaya during the early medieval period. One name returns again and again in Bhutan's sacred geography, Padmasambhava, also known as Guru Rinpoche. Whether approached as history, hagiography, or living faith, the story functions the same way it explains why cliffs, caves, and remote ledges feel spiritually charged in Bhutan, as if the mountains themselves became temples before humans built anything at all. Nowhere captures this better than Paro Taksang Tiger's Nest, a monastery site clinging to a cliff above the Paro Valley. The legends speak of Guru Rinpoche meditating in caves in the region, and the image is so vivid it becomes almost cinematic. Sheer rock, cold air, prayer flags, snapping like signals. And the feeling that devotion here is not a gentle act. It is an ascent. Even without leaning too hard on myth, the deeper truth remains. Bhutan's sacred places are not placed on the landscape. They are woven into it. A monastery is not just a building. It is a point of contact between human time and geological time, between a life that lasts decades and a mountain that lasts millions of years. That worldview changes everything. It changes how people interpret storms and seasons. It changes how a community treats a forest not simply as timber, but as presence. It changes how a peak can become more than a challenge. It becomes a boundary, a being, a silence that should not be violated. This helps explain why in Bhutan, spiritual practice is often described as inseparable from place. The landscape becomes a teacher. Valleys become chapters. Passes become thresholds. And the act of moving through the country begins to resemble pilgrimage, even when the traveler is only going home. But Bhutan's early culture was never only spiritual. It was also administrative practical and fiercely organized because mountain societies have to be. When food stores are finite and winters are long, communities need systems. They need rules. They need cooperation and coordination across terrain that isolates. This is where Bhutan's distinctive architecture and governance tradition begins to appear as more than aesthetics. The fortress-monastery, what Bhutan calls a dzong, makes sense in a mountainous world. A dzong is a statement protection administration and spiritual authority in one structure. It stands where it can control movement near river confluences, valley entrances, or strategic ridges. It is a solution built out of stone and belief. And around these centers, Bhutan's society learned to balance the sacred and the secular without fully separating them. People's daily lives. Farming herding trade continued with the blunt realism of mountain survival. Yet at the same time, festivals, rituals, and monastic institutions created shared rhythms that could travel across valleys. Even if two communities were separated by a hard pass and harsh weather, they could still recognize one another in chant symbols and seasonal ceremonies. That's how cultural cohesion begins in a place like Bhutan, not through uniformity, but through echoes, repeated patterns that survive distance. And it raises a quiet question. When a country is made of valleys that once lived like islands, what finally turns those islands into one story? What kind of leader? What kind of crisis? What kind of moment would be powerful enough to pull scattered worlds into a single identity? The answer in Bhutan's timeline will lead into the age of state formation, when spiritual authority and political consolidation begin to lock together, and when the kingdom becomes more legible as a nation rather than a patchwork of regions. But before reaching that turning point, it's worth sitting with the earlier reality. Bhutan's foundation is not a single origin story. It is a layered one, people adapting to altitude communities, negotiating with the mountain cultures, blending across ridges, and a spiritual worldview that makes geography feel alive. In most countries, nature is where humans build their story. In Bhutan, nature is already telling one, and humans are forced to speak back with humility. So here is the question that prepares the next chapter. If belief can bind valleys together, can it also bind power together? And when the sacred becomes the backbone of governance, what does a nation gain? And what does it risk losing? For centuries, Bhutan's mountains did more than shape rivers and forests. They shaped politics. In a land where one valley can be cut off by a single pass, power rarely arrives all at once. It gathers slowly through alliances, through monasteries, through strategic fortresses, through the ability to control movement and food in a vertical world. A major turning point came in the 17th century, when Zhabdrung Ngawang Namgyal is widely credited with unifying Bhutan and establishing a system where religious and civil authority were intertwined. In historical descriptions of Bhutan's governance, he is linked to the Chosidnai dual system, a structure that split authority between a religious head and a civil administrator, while keeping the state's spiritual identity at its core. This is where Bhutan's iconic dzongs become more than architecture. They become strategy. Built like fortress monasteries, dzongs anchored administration, protected trade routes, and projected a single idea into scattered valleys. There is a center. There is order. There is continuity. Over time, these centers helped stitch together regions that geography naturally tries to keep apart. But even with a unifying vision, Bhutan's internal balance was never effortless. After the Zhabdrung's era, power often fragmented into regional rivalries. In a mountainous country, regional lords could become near sovereign in their own territories simply because the terrain allowed them to be. The story of Bhutan is not a straight line from unified to modern. It is a long negotiation between valleys and capitals, between tradition and reform, between isolation and exposure. Then the outside world began to press closer. The Himalaya were never completely sealed. Trade and religious movement flowed across high borders. But the 19th and early 20th centuries brought a new kind of pressure imperial geopolitics. By the early 1900s, Bhutan's trajectory became closely linked to the rise of a new political center in Trongsa. Ugyen Wangchuck, a powerful regional leader, emerged as the figure who could stabilize the country internally while managing external relationships. In 1907, he became Bhutan's first hereditary monarch, Druk Gyalpo, marking a major shift away from older patterns of divided authority. A few years later, Bhutan's relationship with British India was formalized in the Treaty of Punakha, 1910, signed at Punakha Dzong. This treaty is commonly described as an arrangement in which Britain agreed not to interfere in Bhutan's internal affairs, while Bhutan agreed to be guided by Britain in external relations, paired with an increased subsidy. It's easy to read treaties like this as cold diplomacy, but in Bhutan, the deeper reality is more intimate survival at the edge of empires. When larger powers compete around you, neutrality becomes a skill, and sovereignty becomes something you protect with patience and precision. Bhutan's mountains offered defense, but diplomacy offered continuity. After 1947, the region transformed again with the end of British rule in India. Bhutan's orientation shifted toward its southern neighbor, but it still moved cautiously. Modernization did not arrive as a sudden wave. It arrived as a deliberate decision. A clear marker of that decision appears with Bhutan's first planned development era. Bhutan's first five-year plan, 1961 to 1966, focused on fundamentals: roads, communications, power transport, and agriculture, essentially building the physical spine a modern state needs in order to exist beyond isolated valleys. This is one of Bhutan's defining historical tensions. To connect the country, roads must be cut into mountains. But cutting roads into mountains changes everything: movement, trade, culture, and exposure. When a new road arrives, a valley is no longer an island. Opportunity enters, but so do pressures, markets, and outside values. And still, Bhutan continued opening outward step by step. In 1971, Bhutan ended a major chapter of international isolation by becoming a member of the United Nations. It's a single date, but it signals a deep shift. Bhutan was now willing to be seen and to participate in a world that rarely slows down. Modernization accelerated in ways that were both visible and subtle. Schools expanded, health systems improved, administration professionalized. At the same time, Bhutan tried to defend cultural continuity, not by freezing tradition in place, but by deciding which changes should be allowed to arrive and when. Sometimes, that cautious timing becomes a headline. One example often cited in media studies is that television was officially launched in Bhutan on June 2, 1999, an event described as a dramatic change in the media landscape. The detail matters not because television is inherently good or bad, but because it represents a choice, letting global imagery enter a society that had long been shaped more by mountains than by screens. Then came a political transformation that many countries experienced through upheaval, yet Bhutan pursued through a managed, self-directed transition. The country adopted its written constitution on July 18, 2008, formalizing Bhutan as a constitutional monarchy and embedding principles meant to guide governance for the long term. This is the historical arc that makes Bhutan so compelling to document. The nation did not simply modernize. It tried to modernize without surrendering its core identity. It built roads, then asked what roads would do to culture. It joined the world, then asked what the world would demand in return. It welcomed development, then tried to define development on its own terms. And now Bhutan stands at a new edge, one that isn't geographic. The old edge was the mountain pass, snow-wind risk isolation. The new edge is the modern world itself, speed attention, migration, climate pressure, economic temptation. So here's the question the history leaves hanging in the air. When a country has spent centuries protecting itself from being swallowed by terrain and empires, what happens when the biggest force is no longer outside the borders, but inside the minds of its own young generation, deciding whether to stay, leave, adapt, or refuse? Modern Bhutan is often described with a kind of admiration that borders on disbelief, a mountain kingdom that protected its forests, limited mass tourism, and tried to define progress in its own language. But admiration can sometimes blur the harder truth, because the present is where all ideals get tested. Bhutan's environmental model is real. The constitutional promise to maintain at least 60% forest cover is not symbolic, it is a legal commitment. And the scale of protection is extraordinary. More than half of the country is described as protected areas and biological corridors built to keep ecosystems connected rather than fragmented into isolated green patches. Yet the Himalaya do not respond to policy alone. The climate system is changing, and mountain environments amplify change in ways that feel sudden and unforgiving. Recent reporting on Bhutan points to increasing climate-related risks, glacial melt flood threats, and hazards that pressure communities and infrastructure. In steep terrain, a warmer world isn't just a warmer world. It becomes heavier rain, more unstable slopes, and rivers that can turn from lifeline to threat. In some parts of the Himalaya, glacial lakes can expand as glaciers retreat, raising concerns about sudden outburst floods. Bhutan has worked on climate adaptation and risk reduction, but the underlying reality remains: when ice changes at the top of a watershed, everything downstream eventually feels it. So the first modern tension in Bhutan is this. You can protect your forests, but you cannot fully protect your climate. And then there is the human question. How does life change when the old survival logic no longer matches the new economy? In highland Bhutan, traditional livelihoods like yak herding have long been more than an occupation. They are a way of organizing time, family, and identity. The herders read clouds, the way city people read traffic lights. They move with seasons. They respect storms because storms can kill. But as conditions shift through climate variability, changing pasture patterns, and the pull of urban opportunity, those livelihoods can become harder to sustain. Reporting from recent years has highlighted pressures on highland pastoral communities, including the challenges faced by yak herders. This is where the Bhutan story becomes quietly heartbreaking. Not because people are losing tradition in a dramatic cinematic collapse, but because they can lose it gradually, one household at a time. A young person leaves for education. Another leaves for a job. The knowledge of certain routes, herbs' weather signals, and pasture timing becomes thinner in the community, until one day, a practice that shaped centuries feels like something only older people remember with their bodies. At the same time, Bhutan's towns are changing. Thimphu grows not like a chaotic megacity, but like a capital learning how to be modern. Cafes appear. Youth culture becomes more global. Phones turn remote valleys into places with instant connection. A country once filtered by mountains is now filtered by algorithms. And that creates a second modern tension. If your identity was built on geographic isolation, what happens when isolation disappears? Tourism sits right inside this tension, because tourism is a mirror. It reflects what outsiders want to see, and it pressures locals to decide what they will show. Bhutan famously pursued a high-value, low-volume approach to tourism for decades. And in recent policy, that approach is expressed through the Sustainable Development Fee, SDF, currently described around US 100 per person per night for many international visitors, with specific rules and exemptions that can change over time. The purpose is often described as supporting sustainability culture, infrastructure, and social services, essentially making tourism pay for the privilege of entering a fragile place. Supporters see this as ethical design: fewer tourists, less pressure, more funding for national priorities. Critics sometimes ask harder questions. Who gets to experience Bhutan if entry is expensive? Does protection also become exclusion? How do local businesses thrive if visitor numbers remain limited? These aren't simple debates, and Bhutan's answer continues to evolve. But the more intimate question is cultural. Bhutan's festivals, Kishichus, are still living events, not just performances. Masks, drum stories of protection and transformation. For locals, these are not staged for tourists. They are staged for the community and the sacred. Yet when cameras multiply, even a living ritual can start to feel observed in a new way. The pressure is subtle to become representative, to become shareable, to become something that fits the expectations outsiders bring with them. This is Bhutan's third tension. How do you protect a living culture from becoming a product? And beneath all of these tensions, climate youth migration, tourism, modernization, there is a deeper one that almost every society faces now: the battle for attention. Bhutan's historic advantage was slowness. Its geography enforced patience. The road over a pass could take hours. The seasons dictated timing. Silence was normal. In that world, values like restraint and reverence weren't trendy, they were necessary. But in the modern world, speed becomes addictive. People move faster. News arrives instantly. Comparison becomes constant. And suddenly, a young person in a mountain valley can feel the pull of a life they've never touched. This doesn't mean Bhutan is losing its values. It means its values are being tested in real time by the same forces that test every other country: economic pressure, global media, climate instability, and the desire for a future that feels secure. And yet Bhutan continues to insist on something rare: that progress should not only be measured in money or speed, that there is a moral dimension to development, that nature is not separate from national identity, that happiness, or at least well-being, can be treated as a public responsibility. That insistence is why Bhutan matters far beyond its borders. Because it is not just a place. It is an argument. So here is the question that leads into the ending. If Bhutan is trying to prove that another kind of modern life is possible, one that protects forests, limits exploitation, and honors cultural continuity, what does the rest of the world owe it? And what does Bhutan owe its own future generations, who must live inside the consequences of that experiment? Bhutan doesn't feel like a country you simply visit. It feels like a question you walk inside. Because here, the landscape is not passive. The mountains rise like a warning and a promise at the same time. The forests are not just scenery. They are a national vow, written into law, meant to outlive any single generation. And the story of Bhutan is not only about beauty, it's about boundaries, what a society chooses not to do, even when the world insists it should. In one direction, Bhutan faces the same pressures. Every modern place faces a warming planet that reshapes mountain water and increases risk, even if you protect your own land with care. In another direction, it faces the quieter pressure that can be even more powerful: time. The slow shift of livelihoods, the pull of cities, the hunger of global attention, the temptation to turn culture into content. And still Bhutan tries. It tries to keep half its land protected through parks and corridors so nature can move as the world changes. It tries to design tourism so the act of arriving comes with responsibility, not entitlement. It tries to modernize without dissolving into sameness.